dozen pro-Israel political action committees active in American politics. And over that period, they've given about $55 million to candidates for office. This is just the PAC money. I'm not talking about individual contributions or anything like that. Now, if you want to get a sense of what the balance of power is, there are 3 Arab American PACs, and over that same period, they've given a total of $800,000. So you've got $55 million on one side and $800,000 on the other, and we know how American politics works. If you were running for Congress, who would you be more inclined to listen to? Finally, on some occasions, AIPAC and other groups have targeted specific officials who they've decided were insufficiently supportive of Israel and been successful at driving them out of office. They don't win every time they target someone, but every congressman, and certainly every presidential candidate, knows you are playing with fire if you question American support for Israel. To quote J.J. Goldberg, who's the editor of the Jewish newspaper Forward, a few years ago, he said, quote, "There's this feeling in Congress, you don't cross these people or they take you down." This is why Steve Rosen, a former AIPAC official, once put a napkin in front of a journalist from the New Yorker and said, in 24 hours, we could have the signature of 70 senators on this napkin. AIPAC was ranked the second most powerful lobby in a 2003 survey of congressional staff by the National Journal. It was ranked second in an earlier survey by Forbes magazine in 1997. Bill Clinton said that AIPAC was, quote, better than anyone else lobbying in this town. Newt Gingrich, who didn't agree with Clinton about very many things, said it was the most effective general interest group across the entire planet. Former Congressman Lee Hamilton, who served in Congress for 34 years, said there's no group that matches it. They're in a class by themselves. The late Barry Goldwater wrote in his memoirs, "I was never put under greater pressure than by the Israel lobby, and that goes for the Senate as a whole. It's the most influential group in Congress by far." Former Senator Fritz Hollings said, as he was leaving office and retiring, said, "You can't have an Israel policy other than what AIPAC gives you around here." And that's, of course, why former Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Olmert said in 2006, "Thank God we have AIPAC, the greatest supporter and friend we have in the whole world." Just as a footnote, it always made me wonder why our writing on this subject was considered controversial, given that we were basically just elaborating on a point that leading politicians in both parties had said repeatedly. I want to underscore, by the way, it's not just AIPAC, there are other groups as well, including a subset of the Christian evangelical movement. The point is that one strategy is the familiar playing of American politics. They just play the game the way other groups do, and do so very well. The second strategy is to try and shape public discourse, how Israel is discussed and covered in the United States, to generate pro-Israel attitudes, to maintain support within the broader population. As I suggested at the outset, mainstream media in the United States tend to be pretty strongly pro-Israel, especially in editorial commentary and in terms of pundits and columnists. If you compare coverage in the United States with either coverage in Europe or coverage in Israel itself, there is a much narrower range of views here in the United States. If you look at columnists in the United States, major newspapers like the Washington Post, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Chicago Tribune, LA Times, there's no equivalent in terms of regular columnists of someone like Akiva Elder or Myra Haas or Bradley Burston or Gideon Levy, all of whom write for newspapers in Israel and are very critical often of Israeli policy in ways that no American columnist regularly is. And my point is not that critics like Haas or Levy or Elder are always right and that people who are pro-Israel are always wrong. My point is simply that voices like theirs, published regularly in Israel, but are almost completely absent in mainstream media here in the United States. But even so, watchdog groups like the Anti-Defamation League monitor media coverage, organize boycotts and demonstrations against news agencies that publish anything critical of Israel. Groups like Campus Watch monitor what goes on college campuses, try to put pressure on universities. And to give you just 2 examples, when Jimmy Carter published his book, Palestine, Peace, Not Apartheid, the ADL took out ads in major newspapers around the country which included the publisher's phone number and encouraged people who read the ad to call the publisher and complain about the fact that they had published Jimmy Carter's book. Similarly, a couple of years ago, CNN came under what the Jewish newspaper Forward called unprecedented attack for broadcasting a three-part series comparing Jewish, Muslim, and Christian fundamentalists. And the Conference of Presidents of major American Jewish organizations urged its various member organizations to take up this issue with any companies that had purchased advertising time on CNN for the program. And the purpose here is deterrence, so that CNN will think twice about broadcasting a documentary like that again. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, efforts to prevent any real criticism of Israel often include smearing critics by accusing them of being anti-Semites. So Martin Peretz, the former editor of the New Republic, wrote that Jimmy Carter, quote, will go down in history as a Jew hater. Another critic wrote in the Washington Post that Carter's views were similar to those of David Duke, the former head of the Ku Klux Klan. Yet another pro-Israel newspaper wrote an article suggesting that Carter was sympathetic to Nazi-era war criminals. Similarly, when the nonpartisan, highly respected human rights group Human Rights Watch reported on Israel's war crimes during the 2006 war in Lebanon, its director, Kenneth Roth, was repeatedly smeared with the charge that he was an anti-Semite. Even though Roth is in fact Jewish, his father was a refugee from Nazi Germany. Worth noting, by the way, that Human Rights Watch also condemned Hezbollah for its own violations of the laws of war. And as some of you undoubtedly know, similar smears are now being directed at Richard Goldstone, the South African jurist who directed the UN investigation over possible war crimes by both Hamas and Israel in the recent fighting in Lebanon. Now, as you might expect, accusations of anti-Semitism were also leveled at my co-author and myself, even though there is not the slightest shred of evidence behind the charge. In November 2007, the ADL issued a press release saying that Jew hatred lives on in speeches by Iranian President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad and in the writings of Professors Mearsheimer and Walt. We were also frequently compared to that infamous fraud, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, Jeff Goldberg, who once